I'm not having any luck on this trip. I need a break. That's when I spotted the moto scoot. Ooh, this is cool.
The moto scoot is a very rare scooter.
How about $850? I mean, I see a lot of things here I don't know if you're doing anything with. I'll do $1,000 on it.
Millions watched him pick through America's forgotten treasures, but no one expected what he was hiding in his own home.
How about this guy? There's only one reason I would want it. 75 bucks.
No.
How about $80? No, we're 20 away. Can't do it.
Where are you going to find them any better shape?
All right, I'm putting it back.
When Frank Fritz was found unresponsive in his Iowa farmhouse, fans grieved the quiet American Picker's co-host. But as investigators stepped inside his mansion, they found something that even his closest friends didn't fully know. A hidden treasure trove worth millions. And that was just the beginning. What was Frank really collecting all these years? Who tried to steal his fortune after his stroke? And what dark truth did his handwritten journals expose about his final days? Today, we'll uncover the mansion, the lies, and the secrets the cameras never showed. The secret he never showed. Frank Fritz was never interested in flaunting success. Unlike many TV personalities, he chose a quiet life in Iowa over fame and luxury. His farmhouse looked simple, almost modest. But behind its weathered exterior, Frank had hidden something extraordinary, an unmatched collection that would stun even the most seasoned collectors. After Frank's stroke in 2022, authorities entered his home expecting a typical Midwest residence. What they found instead was part museum, part-time capsule. In the garage alone were over 75 vintage motorcycles stacked from floor to ceiling. Some were in pristine condition, others showed their age, but even those bore value. Among them, a 1947 Indian Chief prototype, believed to be one of a kind and estimated at $250,000. That was just the start. Gleaming Indian Scouts from the 1920s, rare Harley-Davidson panheads from the 1950s, and a 1939 Indian 4, nicknamed the Aristocrat, were all stored with meticulous care. But it wasn't just the rarity of the bikes that impressed. It was the way Frank preserved them. Each bike had a handwritten label or folder nearby. Inside drawers and boxes were dozens of journals, not lists of parts or prices, but detailed records of each bike's origin, history, and emotional significance. Frank documented where he found each one, who sold it to him, what it reminded him of, and even how long restorations took. One entry described how the engine sound of a specific bike took him back to his first pick with Mike Wolf. These weren't just machines. They were living memories. The investigators were on the track of models that had been missing from the realm of collectors for decades. In an episode of American Pickers, a 1922 Ace 4 had been purchased for $45 and would have now been worth over $200,000. The memory of a 1912 bike was stored along with a leather saddle, original but cracked, as some bikes were fully restored, others rusted and incomplete. To Frank, they all mattered. They all had a story that needed saving. Even close friends had not known the full extent of his secret collection. "We knew he loved bikes," one said. "We didn't know he had something that could rival a museum." Interest in his estate was piqued quickly from collectors all over the globe, a lot calling it one of the most significant private motorcycle collections in recent memory, not only for its rarity, but also because it had been kept from public view. A beat-up old van could be in some corner of the garage. For an untrained eye, this vehicle seemed like junk, but for those acquainted with American rock history, the van was an instant giveaway. Aerosmith's original tour van, the very one discovered years ago by Frank and Mike deep inside a Massachusetts forest. Many thought it had met either a kind fate or oblivion. Frank kept this gem to himself, restoring it to a bit of glory and respect for that van as a fragment of music history. To fans, Frank was the guy on American Pickers who loved antiques, but to those who stepped inside his garage, he was something more, a guardian of forgotten history. And while his collection stunned experts, it was only one part of a much bigger story: the rise of a reluctant star. Before he was famous, Frank Fritz was just a quiet guy from Iowa who loved old things. A former fire inspector, Frank never chased the spotlight. He preferred antiques over attention, back roads over red carpets. So when television came calling, he almost said no. Fame wasn't part of the plan. He was a picker, someone who rescued forgotten history, not someone seeking headlines. But fate, and a lifelong friend, changed that. Frank's journey didn't start in a studio. It started in barns, garages, and roadside shops. Alongside his childhood friend Mike Wolfe, whom he'd known since 8th grade, Frank had been digging through America's leftovers for years. While others saw junk, they saw stories. Even before the cameras arrived, they were already living the American picker's life. Around 2002, Mike began filming their adventures with a handheld camera. He had a dream, a show about picking. But he needed a co-star, someone genuine, relatable, and real. Frank was the perfect fit. Mike shot dozens of episodes on spec before the History Channel agreed to air a pilot. When American Pickers debuted in 2010, Frank unexpectedly became a star. At first, Frank was hesitant. He liked his routine, his shop, Frank's Finds, in Savannah, Illinois. He liked being left alone. But one big sale, a fraternal badge bought for $115 and sold for over $400, proved that his knowledge mattered. That moment gave him the confidence to hit the road with Mike. Chemistry was instant when they first appeared together on screen. Mike was a ball of energy, happy, loud, and very talkative. Frank was more earthbound, calm, observant, and relatable. Frank's truthfulness and humility made viewers identify with him. He didn't put on an act. He simply chose to talk about history, fair bargaining, and honoring the story of each item. The show was a hit. It premiered with over 3 million viewers, cementing itself as one of the greatest launches on the History Channel. Frank was quick to build his fan base. People stood in queues for autographs and pictures. His fans cherished him for his goodness and integrity. And he had what collectors call a picker's eye, the knack of seeing value in the overlooked. And he never lost perspective of what picking meant to him, not money, but meaning. His love for motorcycles made him dearer. Since the age of 16, he collected motorbikes and exhibited immense knowledge about his endeavor. Be it a 1938 Indian 4 or a Harley Panhead, Frank was not imitating. He knew and loved every piece he discovered. But fame has a price. Fame usually follows him. Airports, gas stations, restaurants. Considering that someone always loves their own privacy, all these events become trademark draining. And on top of that, the frequent travel and filming just made it more challenging for Frank to cope. He also privately battled with the pains and lifelong humiliations brought about by a disease called Crohn's, which he rarely mentioned in public. He revealed to his friends that the constant pressure of being on for work was exhausting. The turmoil of work pressure, schedules, and health issues began to sink him. But he hid it well. On screen, he appeared to be calm, full of compassion, warmth, and passion for times gone by. Frank's agency wasn't in performing, it was in connecting. He cared about stories and souls. He dignified the worthless and offered history to a world of people. In American Pickers' ascent to fame, Frank's quiet charm became the show's heart. But in the background, conflict brewed behind the curtain, tensions among behind-the-scenes conflicts, health complications, and uninvited fame. And, in the end, it would all catch up to him. When the spotlight faded, at the peak of his fame, Frank Fritz seemed unstoppable. As co-host of American Pickers, he had a loyal fan base, a hit show, and a dream turned reality. But behind the scenes, a quiet unraveling was underway. A mix of health struggles, personal pain, and emotional strain that would eventually lead to a devastating collapse. Frank had long dealt privately with Crohn's disease, a chronic condition he'd battled since his 20s. The grueling filming schedule, constant travel, and physical labor only made things harder. Still, he pushed through with quiet resilience, hiding his discomfort from viewers. By 2017, cracks started to show. That year, Frank was pulled over for driving on the wrong side of the road. He admitted to drinking and taking Xanax for anxiety, later failing a sobriety test. It was the first public sign of deeper issues: anxiety, mounting pressure, and the heavy toll of fame. He avoided jail with a plea deal, but the emotional damage lingered. His once close bond with co-star Mike Wolfe began to fray. While Mike remained the face of the show, Frank felt pushed into the background. By 2021, he said they hadn't spoken in 2 years. After back surgery, Frank said Mike never reached out. He compared their dynamic to being in a band with Steven Tyler. He was never going to be the frontman. When Mike publicly said he missed Frank, Frank dismissed it as fake. Their rift ran deep, and then came the pandemic. Frank's already fragile state plunged even deeper into darkness after he fell at home, re-injured his spine, and faced isolation while relying on painkillers during lockdown. After which, he had ruined his healing, had gone through another set of surgeries, and started using opioids for pain relief. The beginning of the medically required pain relief turned into dependency. Friends staged interventions. The show offered him a once-in-a-lifetime chance, of course, being that he could pass a substance test. He couldn't. The last episode he appeared was aired in March 2020. Initially, it was said that he had gone on an indefinite leave, but in July 2021, Mike announced that Frank was not coming back. Fans were shocked. Frank was once the very heart of American Pickers, and now was left with hardly an explanation. The blow ran deep. After focusing his life returns to collecting and history, Frank suddenly felt erased, not just from the show, but the community he helped build. His physical strength faded. Even more, though, so did his spirit. On July 14, 2022, Frank's friend found him unconscious inside his farmhouse located in Iowa. A massive stroke had left him. Paramedics carried him to the hospital, but it was only later that he was transferred to a nursing facility. Once, he traveled around the country spreading folklore stories about discovered treasures. Now, however, he could only mumble words and fully depend on the assistance of others to look after him. The stroke left one side of his body paralyzed. His speech was affected, and there was damage to both his cognitive and physical functions, requiring full-time assistance. A court conservator was appointed. Among his millions, which totaled $6 million, his estate was now responsible for $30,000 a month for the medical expenses. Old friend Chris Davis was made guardian over him. Yet, above all that, as Frank strove in a physical sense to recover, something much deeper slipped away: his will to fight on. The keen observation of friend Jerry Jandro, Frank knew what was happening. He tried to lift an arm and failed. He tried to speak, but found the words came unwillingly. It was quite a cruel blow to a man who once was full of life and passion, to lose both his voice and mobility. Frank Fritz, who once devoted his life to the preservation of truly old items, appeared to be overlooked by the world around him, not by fans. The show moved on. Fame faded. All that remained for this man, who had once brought joy to the lives of millions, was a silent and heartbreaking struggle. While Frank's health was deteriorating, the treasures he had quietly protected for decades were about to be discovered. And those discoveries, hidden in a locked garage behind an unassuming house, would soon tell a story far bigger than any episode of American Pickers ever had. Inside the mansion after the stroke. When Frank Fritz suffered a massive stroke in July 2022, most fans were unaware of how fragile his life had become. But while the public focused on his health, something more revealing unfolded inside his Iowa farmhouse, a place frozen in time, rich with history, heartbreak, and one surprising discovery after another. From the outside, the home wasn't lavish. Tucked in the Iowa countryside, it looked modest and old-fashioned. But inside, it was a treasure trove, a personal museum built over decades by a man who made a living preserving the past. When conservators and court-appointed guardians entered to assess Frank's condition and protect his estate, they were stunned. His house wasn't just a home, it was a vault of forgotten Americana. The living room was anything but ordinary. Instead of sofas and a TV, it held rows of display cases filled with vintage tins, 19th-century tools, and antique advertising. A gleaming 1950s jukebox still played rock and roll, and beside it stood a fully restored gas pump in red enamel and chrome. Bookshelves overflowed with manuals, collector's guides, and handwritten notes. Further into the house, the collection grew even more personal. A hallway led to a space resembling a library, but instead of books, shelves displayed old toys, soda fountain memorabilia, and porcelain signs. One shelf was dedicated entirely to Cracker Jack prizes, another to mid-century political campaign buttons. It was more than a collection. It was a time capsule crafted by someone who saw value in what others had discarded. In the kitchen, life had come to a halt. Dishes sat dry in the sink. A 2022 calendar hung askew on the wall. Yet even here, Frank's character showed through. An old Coca-Cola clock ticked above the doorway. A 1940s toaster still plugged in. On the table sat a notebook, half filled with a list of items Frank still hoped to find. Dreams paused, but not forgotten. Rooms upstairs were more minuscule for the peak. One room had tightly rolled motorcycle t-shirts, dating from the Sturgis rallies in the 80s. A worn leather jacket was patched and pinned by the years before, hanging on a closet door from different trips across the country. A small wooden box on a desk contained several Polaroid snaps of Frank in various towns written across America, smiling beside the treasures of his love. But the most haunting space was hidden. Behind a bland utility door stood a staircase leading down to the basement, constructed for raw, unfinished conditions, which held the most fabulous space in this house. Inside, lines of labeled boxes were placed along the stone walls. Each one of them held Frank's handwriting. Sturgis 91, fire-depth gear, Disney pre-1980, World War II medals. In them were rare and obscure finds. Antique razors dating back to the early 1900s, gas station uniforms preserved, brass firefighter helmets, and vintage Disney memorabilia. And among these artifacts were dozens of journals. They weren't mere diaries, but day-by-day logs of Frank's life of collecting. He noted where items came from, who owned them, how much he paid, and what they meant to him, interspersed with reflections on his health, his battles with Crohn's disease, his falling out with co-star Mike Wolfe, and his deepening sense of isolation. The journals reflected a man struggling with more than physical suffering, with a gradual snipping away at the show, friends, and even himself. But up to those dark notes, there was always that flame of passion. The house was not empty, just paused. Every object was a fraction of his story. With news of Frank's condition, the outside world turned its gaze toward his home. Fans, collectors, and friends would eventually want to see what happened to all this. But for the ones stepping inside after the stroke, it was not merely antiques or motorcycles. It was a man's life captured in mid-sentence. And hidden beneath the layers of dust and time, they were about to discover the collection that would shock the world. The $3 million hidden collection. What most people knew about Frank Fritz was only a fraction of the truth. After his passing in 2024, friends, caretakers, and estate officials expected to find a few antiques and personal mementos. Instead, they uncovered one of the most remarkable private collections in American history, valued at over $3 million. It began in a weather-worn barn. There, they found more than 75 vintage motorcycles, some fully restored, others aged but incredibly rare. Among them, a 1947 Indian Chief prototype, believed to be the only one in existence and estimated at $250,000. Nearby were Harley-Davidson panheads from the 1950s, vintage Triumphs, BBSAs, and a 1939 Indian 4, known as the Aristocrat, worth over $115,000. Every bike was preserved with care. Some still had original tags or notes taped to the tanks. Crates of rare parts surrounded them: carburetors, leather saddlebags, and obsolete components, each cataloged with handwritten records. Frank had documented the history of each motorcycle, where he found it, who sold it, and what it meant to him. These weren't just machines. They were stories. But the collection extended far beyond motorcycles. In another shed was a trove of firefighting memorabilia: brass extinguishers, leather helmets, antique fire alarms, and a restored horse-drawn fire wagon from the early 1900s. Some badges and equipment were believed lost to time, now rediscovered and meticulously preserved. Then came a building filled with vintage signs and Americana, rare porcelain ads for Coca-Cola, Sinclair oil signs, Route 66 road markers, and even an original 1900s Jell-O delivery wagon. Many pieces had never been publicly displayed. A neon Mohawk gasoline sign alone was valued in the 5 figures. In a back garage, under a dusty tarp, they made a jaw-dropping discovery: Aerosmith's original tour van. Frank and Mike Wolfe had found it abandoned in 2018, but most assumed it was long gone. It wasn't. Frank had kept and partially restored it, parking it next to vintage instruments, vinyl records, and band memorabilia. For music fans, it was a sacred relic, lovingly preserved in secret. From Frank's perspective, even more surprising was the discovery of early Star Wars collectibles, including 4 1978 Proto-Yoda figures manufactured by Lucasfilm artists and thought destroyed after all. Each was authenticated and appraised for more than $6,000. Found at a small estate sale, Frank seemed to have a knack for seeing what others overlooked. All around the estate, caretakers found dozens of leather-bound journals in lockers and drawers, wherein Frank had recorded everything from how he found each item, what he paid for it, and its significance. Some entries reflect an emotional nature. Frank would muse about the people he met, members of his family, or those who brought him back to childhood. One entry stood out when he stated, "If these ever go to auction, I hope they don't just see dollar signs. These are my memories." The whole world rang with the sounds of this historic discovery. Auction houses went on a bidding frenzy for the rights to represent the estate. Museums clamored for the artifacts. The internet community and collector discussion groups lit up with astonishment from news about the enormity and quality of the collection. The early estimates slated it at $2 million. Subsequent appraisals, however, identified an even greater worth, probably in the range of $3 million or more. Yet, apart from the bewitching figures, was that which truly pulled at people's heartstrings: the pure love of all that went into it. Frank had not stored trash. He conserved true history, intertwined with deep respect and very personal meaning. His estate felt less like a home and more like a private museum, where every item tells a story of a life dedicated to the honoring of the forgotten. Ultimately, the greatest surprise turned out not to be the value of Frank's clandestine collection, but the clarity with which it expressed his identity. A man who found worth in what others abandoned and quietly fashioned, a legacy out of memory, passion, and soul. But while the world stood in awe of what Frank had built, a bitter question surfaced: who would get to keep it? And in that question, the battle for Frank's legacy began, not in barns or showrooms, but in a courtroom filled with doubt. The legal battle for Frank's fortune. What should have been a quiet tribute to Frank Fritz's legacy quickly turned into a legal firestorm. Just months after his passing in 2024, Frank's $6 million estate, including a $3 million hidden collection, was thrown into uncertainty. In February 2025, Frank's father, William "Bill" Fritz, filed a lawsuit claiming the will submitted to probate was a fraud. The contested will, dated 2023, left nearly all of Frank's assets to close friends and caregivers, people who had supported him after his 2022 stroke. Bill wasn't mentioned at all. That, he claimed, was both suspicious and legally impossible. According to Bill's legal team, Frank had been declared incapacitated by a court in 2022, meaning he couldn't legally sign any documents, including a will, the following year. If true, the document would be void, and as Frank's surviving parent, Bill would inherit everything by default. The argument had weight. Court records showed that Frank was placed under conservatorship after his stroke, with his longtime friend Chris Davis handling personal decisions and a local bank managing his finances. Both were required to report to the court, confirming that Frank was no longer capable of handling his own affairs. Bill's attorneys focused on this ruling, demanding a jury trial and launching an investigation into who had submitted the will. If found to be forged or manipulated, the consequences could go beyond inheritance. Criminal charges could follow. For the future defenders of Frank in 2023, events turned out to be quite different. They stated that Frank had moments of clarity, and would have had that would reflect his true intentions. According to them, Frank had moved away from his father, and therefore would have wished that those who had taken care of him in his last years got to inherit his estate. Close friends alleged that Bill had not been seen much during the life of the son, especially after the stroke, and that Frank felt abandoned. According to Bill, however, the account was different. He described a close family relationship with Frank, including family vacations, long evenings talking, and sharing the love of fishing. Bill was cut off by the caregivers and manipulated against contact with the son, and then claimed that they had taken advantage of a vulnerable Frank's state to own the estate. Everything was darkened by that litigation. Frank's bank has frozen funds for asset selling and has postponed the selling of assets, including parts of the motorcycle collection. Collection houses, auction houses, and museums stayed away from the site, not wanting to be part of this case that could take a while before it is finally resolved. To the fans, it was heartbreaking. Frank, who once saved forgotten stories and unmasked hidden treasures, is now in the middle of a nasty inheritance spat. Fans online were fighting over this. Some sympathized with friends who had stood by Frank, while others sympathized with Bill as they felt a father had been wrongly excluded. The court, on its part, has moved with the utmost care. Literally, judges reviewed the medical records, as well as the psychiatric evaluations offered and forensic handwriting reports. They scrutinized the will for all inconsistencies, signatures, witness affidavits, notary stamps, and most of all, looking for signs of possible fraud. Every detail is of utmost importance. The result would not just determine who received Frank's estate, but how his legacy would be remembered. The legacy he left behind. As legal battles over Frank Fritz's estate filled headlines, something quieter but far more meaningful was happening. Across the country and beyond, people who had never met Frank began honoring him in the most fitting way possible, by remembering. Not the lawsuits or the headlines, but the man who saw beauty in the forgotten. Fans gathered online to celebrate the legacy of someone who had spent his life honoring history's overlooked corners. People shared stories of watching American pickers, of seeing Frank and Mike cruising small-town roads in search of lost treasures. Some posted photos from meet and greets or spontaneous encounters at antique malls and gas stations. But the most touching were the personal stories. Viewers who picked up collecting because of Frank, who found purpose during tough times, or who bonded with family over the show. In their eyes, Frank didn't just uncover forgotten relics. He helped people reconnect with their own stories. Through these tributes, one truth emerged. Frank helped spark a movement. American Pickers was never just about antiques. It was about rediscovery. Frank embodied that message. He wasn't flashy or scripted. He didn't demand the spotlight. He led with quiet authenticity, showing that true value often hides in the rusted, dusty, or ignored. Viewers trusted him because he was real. He didn't perform, he shared. He wasn't just on TV. He became a guide to finding meaning in the past. Excerpts from the tributes included Frank's personal journals, shared with the few close friends who managed to obtain permission. They were not only records of finds, but emotional writings. Frank would speak about the people behind the antiques, the smells that conjured memories, the sellers evoking dad memories, and the collectors who opened up when they shared their passion with him. Each journal entry opened wider into a man who felt every artifact through his bones. A jukebox wasn't just a machine, it was a memory. A fireman's coat wasn't just gear, it was a time capsule. Some pages of his journals would give as much pain. Frank writes candidly about living with Crohn's disease, attempts to stay sober, lost friendships, and the steep price of fame. But even at those hardest moments, he always found something to hold on to while gathering the threads of hope. He continued to catalog, write, and collect. His journals were not just inventories, they were lifelines. They bore witness to the spirit of man who never ceased to believe in the importance of the old. That belief is actually Frank's true legacy. Not the court circus, not the money, and really not the fame. He reminded people that stories are worth saving, that a dented sign or an old motorcycle may bear generations' worth of meaning, that history is not found in history books. It lives in barns, basements, and attics, waiting for someone who cares to rediscover it. Museums throughout the Midwest now wish to develop a Frank Fritz exhibit that tells the story of his life, motorcycles, and journals. Friends say he would be proud, not because of the attention, but because his real work was succeeding. The past is being honored. There are also rumblings of a memorial ride, an across-the-country motorcycle journey following Frank's favorite picking paths. At each stop, riders, collectors, and fans would gather to tell stories, swap antiques, and remember the man who inspired them. It would not be about fame. It would be all about thankfulness for showing that even things and people long forgotten are still worthy to be remembered. In the end, Frank left not only a collection behind, but also a way of seeing the world through empathy, curiosity, and a profound respect for history. Frank Fritz's life wasn't perfect. It was complicated, painful, and ultimately tragic. But it was also full of beauty, obsession, and love for the forgotten things that built America. What do you think Frank's legacy should be? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and watch the next video on screen for more incredible true stories just like this.